Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
And thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate your presence here. All members on the panel understand how important the Keshe American Knowledge Team meeting is, because we are maybe we could say we're the third base in a big game. The Knowledge Seekers Workshop starting on Thursday, the Brazilian team bringing it up on Friday with a tremendous effort. And then we have so many representatives from all over the world coming in here and try and get to a new kind of understanding. So let us begin. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science. We are discussing the basic Pico tech. And why not discuss Pico stars? My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is February the 8th of 2026, and this is part of the Keshe Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So as we continue in this process, we're trying to distill everything into small bite-sized pieces so that mature knowledge seekers don't get bored and can add to what their knowledge is. But of course, we need to have a welcome mat out for the new knowledge seekers, because they right now are the majority. It's not that they don't know, it's that they don't know that they don't know, that they do know. They don't know that they do know. And that is a key difference. As we're all becoming more and more aware, we have a tendency to create a depression, sort of, because one of two things happen. You know, as we learn about all the maladies on this planet, we become depressed because we are unable to do anything about it. And as we gain more knowledge, we become depressed because we have wasted our time with so many other pathways. But let's understand that all of these pathways bring us to this position. And so they have all edified us in their own different way, and each of us has their own path. And so the depression can easily fade away if we understand that we have the solution, and that solution is within our hands. So in other words, when we talk about the choosing, we are able to choose our own way to go. So we have been in the basic Pico Tech series discussing the Pico core and fundamentally trying to understand a different kind of construction and a deconstruction and a reconstruction. And the point being, it's always construction. So what is the fundamental point, and how does it emit? And the Pico star is an excellent way to define that. So when we define matter, matter is a manifestation of energy, and this technology invites a confusion because we see the small matter state as an old science, and the new capital M matter state is the new science. And the point of the matter is that it is a manifestation, which is binding, and manifestation is also a creation. So we find that the energy binding aspect of it is part of the creation. So energy binding then is to be defined in terms of matter, but what is the beginning matter? So that's why we always ask, oh, it's so funny to ask which came first, the chicken or the egg. Or the simple answer is that the principal matter came first. That's why it is called the principal matter. So the principal matter consists of PM ticks, which are magnetical and they're traveling all over the universe all the time as energy packs. And they get packaged up neatly in a parcel and they get diluted into a force field. How does that force field come together? It's the coming together of the antimatter, dark matter, and the matter gen, and then it becomes converted into a plasma gen. At that point, that plasma gen is now carrying a message and does not manifest into its physicality until it meets another maggrav field of physicality. And then we get that field interaction. We call it an inertia. And so the maggrav condition of the plasma gen with the maggrav condition of the Earth space creates this gravitational maggrav of our physicality. And as a result, things slow down. Yes, they have to slow down because now we're involving a sharing of the energy. So it cannot be the whole part. If we understand that in North America, we're very much still operating as pioneers. And if you recall in the pioneer times, the stagecoaches and the carriages were driven by horses. And it's a slow process because there weren't any roads, things were kind of bumpy. We're talking about pioneers. But we found that it's a lot easier to move when you don't have the carriage dragging behind you. So that's why when you just ride on horseback, you can go a lot farther, a lot faster than you can if you're bringing the chuck wagon behind you. So that affords you a delay in consequences, which means you're still going to get there, but it's going to take a lot slower when you bring the chuck wagon along. So what we're looking at is the results. And the thing is that these results may be visible and or tangible, but we have to understand that they can be non-visible or non-tangible. The point is that when we're talking about an Earth space tangibility and an Earth space matter state, results can be delayed. But the results can be instantaneous as well, because just as we can speed up the reaction or slow down the reaction, then obviously we can gravitate between the two. And so we say the gravitation part, we can see that when we talk about destruction and when we ask this generic question, what happens when two forces come together? Is it destruction or is it creation? We have to understand that the destruction is a kind of creation. So what you really have to ask is what kind of creation are you creating? And this is where the crudeness of matter state comes to the foreground. So the matter plasma dimension, in terms of the plasma science, it's either physical, which you can touch or see, or it's plasmatic, which you can't touch or can't see. But this is all part of the matter plasma dimension, which we are familiar with. And so our understanding of our existence is based on feedback, not on the feedback, not on the feeding. So this is where our dominating approach comes in. So when we understand how we can speed things up, we can go a little bit faster or we can go a lot faster. So as we talk about the Pico stars, we find that we are dealing with something that is extremely tiny. It's out of our visible range, but it is there. And each level, and we've gone 3 levels beyond the nanostate, is an order of magnitude. That is 10 times. And 3 orders of magnitude is 10 times 10 times 10, 1,000 times smaller. And so this Pico star that we're talking about today is a fascinating subject because in 2025, the gold rush began because now we're in the beyond the Beijing era of May the 10th, 2025, when we saw the production of gold coming out of, you could say, coming out of thin air. And in 2026, now we're faced with the silver rush. Well, the rush is just going to keep going. And that rush is not the fact that we are going to be taking off in a rocket. What it means is that we're talking about construction. And the problem with our construction is that in the physical state, we have a delay in consequences, so it takes a lot longer. Construction may take hundreds of years, but some people are proud because destruction can only take a few minutes. But as we said, destruction is a form of construction. So what if construction itself could be faster? Can we change that? Well, look what happens when we freeze a Gauss ball. We have the gravitational core and these magnetical hair-like lines. That's a construction zone. And this is etched right in the ice. And it makes a beautiful picture, but it also creates a pattern, which we see it reflected in the same thing with the Pico atomics. Determine the date or the age of a particular physical manifestation. We use the carbon-14 process. So it shows the transition of time. And then the carbon-16, and it goes on. So we go from the transmission to the transition to the transmutation highway. Well, can we go back? And so we see, yes, well, we can. But, you know, we have to incorporate waveforms on this planet. And so it means that it behooves us to drive a crooked mile just to drive a straight line. And we see that with the Karakoram Highway. It's part of the transmission. We zigzag back and forth, and I guess we eventually get there. But which is the zig and which is the zag? And, you know, is the zig possible without the zag? And it sounds like a stupid question, but when you're looking at frequencies, you need that sine wave in singularity. So as you zig and zag and you go along, you get the total wave. And in singularity, you can see clearly what it is. But what happens in the duality? Well, which wave are you looking at? Or, as we've learned in school, those waves can combine to generate another wave. And so we can actually modulate the singular wave by increasing its amplitude, or we can blur the wave by having overlapping fields. So this is the basic physics. And now when we get into the new plasma physics as put forward by Marian Tevakoli-Kesh through the books like number 1, The Universal Order of Creation of Matter, bringing together the matter, the antimatter, and the dark matter. So that's a combination of 3 coming together. And those 3 came from somewhere, and they go somewhere. So book number 2, The Structure of the Light, talks about that. But how can light have a structure? Like, did you ever try and build a building out of light? Well, in the physical state, that becomes a challenge when we don't understand how picostars work. Because the fact in book number 3, we have the origin of the universe. So clearly, you know, the universe is here. It works. So because you don't understand it, or you can't explain it, or you don't want to hear about it, the universe is still there. It's undeniable. We have our Earth as part of our universe, and our Earth is just a tiny, tiny part of the universe, and it's balanced off by a sister universe, which is so much bigger. And so there's this energy flow that is going between the two. And so this is what we're trying to communicate with. And so Rick Crammond and the members of the Universal Council have been bringing together for 416 weeks the one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace. What? One planet, one nation, one race? Which is it? it's all the same thing. We're all members. All the nations and all the races are all members of this planet. And it is this planet that gives us the fingerprint of our basic manifestation. And so wherever we go, that fingerprint goes with us, and it's our identification, and everyone will know that we're from Earth space. But where are the rest of them? We can't see them. Oh, well, so how did we get here? So we came here through this angular density. We fell here. We're fallen angels. We fell because we're falling through weakness. That weakness implies an increased density, increased pressure, of course, an increased gravity. Isn't that it, right? You walk on the ground, you don't walk on the ceiling. And so we find that as a result of our comfort level there, we've increased the dependence on this Earth space feeding. And that's what it is. It's feeding us. But there's an internal pressure of the Gans fields within us that balance off and conserve this energy. So this angular density is conserved and becomes a conservation of angular momentum. So this is a two-way street. And so when we talk about a two-way street, are we talking about a duality or we're talking about duals? Energy manifests as friction. So maybe that's confrontation where when you bring the hands together, the fists become fighting. This is a form of inertia density manifestation, and we all seem to be too eager to, instead of bringing our hands together to support each other, but clench our fists and, gentlemen, just shake hands and then come out fighting. Isn't that a wonderful form of entertainment? But we have many, many rules, and they are particularly key to humanity. So we have been given 10 commandments, and then we see that there are another 14, and that makes sense because that would be 24 commandments in a world of carbon 12 interacting with carbon 12, 12 and 12 being 24. But the one that I keep relying on is thou shalt not lie, because basically that's the nature of the game of poker. And so how many people go out and say, oh, I'm just going to go down to Las Vegas and play with my friends, play a game of poker. Well, what kind of friends are you playing with when the object of the game not only is to lie and deceive you, but to take your money? So those are the kind of friends you want to associate with? Liars? Well, good luck. And then what happens when you win? Are they still your friends? Or are they jealous and envious that you took all their money? And, oh, what happened at the poker? Oh, my friend took all my money. They don't say that. They say something else. And this is a family show, so we're not going to talk about that. But the point is that the lying becomes a form of self-serving. And that is necessary because it facilitates energy binding that bind us into this dimension point. But it focuses on me, myself, and I. So, the future's so bright that we have to wear shades so to hide what we see. Or is it to hide what we look like? Because we're lying, cheating, and stealing and killing at the expense of others who also depend on this me, myself, and I-ness to be able to derive this self-serving energy binding. But, when we get robbed, then we have to either fight back in a confrontation or we steal it from someone else. But the worst kind of stealing is when we leak on our own. So we don't need an external influence to cause us to lose energy and our vitality. We actually manifest that on our own based on our understanding. And so we get this drainage of our vitality. But as we discussed today, we're looking to enhance the vitality of your motion and physical state. And we can do that so that we don't become old and decrepit. And of course, now we have the young and decrepit. And so the determination really is that age and decrepency does not belong in the same sentence. They're mutually exclusive. And so we can enhance our vitality on the regular way, or can we speed this up? Can we manifest this very, very quickly? So here we go. We look at the susceptibility and singularity, and we created a gravitational field. And that was a gold Gans, but it didn't look like gold until we had an external input of a Gans field of humanity. And so that manifests a susceptibility in duality, and we actually were producing the gold. So this is what we're saying. The inertia field is a coming together of two fields. So whether we're talking about Earth space or we're talking about the galaxy, we see that in the background, the galaxy is formed, and these fields are manifest from these PM ticks, which are traveling magnetically. And as they come together and squeeze together into that gravitational point, we create an inertia field. So these PM ticks create magnetical inertia fields that come together into gravitational inertia fields. So the strength can change. The strength can change by compounding, by overlapping. And so based on the path length and susceptibility, the strength of a conversion field, in order to manifest as a conversion field, has to have a magnetical and gravitational aspect. And we can't tell by that direction where it's going. But if we impart a gravitational magnetical relationship with respect to its direction, then we can change its conformity. And we can bring together these points, and where we can see how a Pico star is manifest. First of all, there has to be a common denominator. It comes in from all different directions. And then when it has to come together, it has to overlap and create a field. And that field does not manifest into its physicality until it has enough strength and enough time, place, and position to be able to achieve that. And so when we look at how this field is rotating, we come to a different kind of anomaly in terms of the rotation of the field, as we see by the galaxy, is very circular. But when we look at the manifestation on this planet, it becomes hexagonal. And strangely enough, we see this repeat with the planet Saturn. When we look at the pole of planet Saturn, it is hexagonal. How is a planet that is rotating with many rings end up with that shape? So this energy interaction is the transaction zone. So we say the singularity requires a solo effort, but the duality requires a partnership. And to have a successful partnership, that requires reciprocity. So any transaction zone needs to have a balance of incentives if it's going to be constructive. And so we see this with carbonic acid. We have this equidistant bonding, and we see the many names that carbonic acid comes into. But what we have is a balance here. And in that point is undifferentiated. It is manifesting itself in our physicality. But is it life-giving or is it life asphyxiating? Because the carbonic acid is a molecule that rapidly converts to water and carbon dioxide in the presence of water. So we all know that carbon dioxide will extinguish a fire, but it will also kill or suffocate whatever's in the presence of that gas. Because the interconversion of carbon dioxide and carbonic acid is related to the breathing process of all aerobic organisms. And it's also related to the acidification of natural waters. So when you consume the oxygen, you acidify the water. Isn't that interesting? So how does this relate to the plasma rule where the higher strength feeds the weaker strength? So compare this to the physical rule where the higher strength beats the weaker strength or the higher strength eats the weaker strength. Either way, it becomes a transaction zone. And so the difference is could be a conflict point or it could be a binding zone. Either way, it is an increase in density and it's a manifestation. So bringing these two fields together or bringing two armies together, it becomes an inertia density manifestation. So as we discussed earlier with the nanocharges, they have to charge and discharge. So there's two types of energy. So it's not a matter of construction or destruction. It's just a question of are we giving to or taking away from? And then when we layer the nano layers, they kind of form a tube. And so now we've created overlapping patterns and we create a different kind of structure. But the nanotube can be easily closed off when we introduce the carbon nanocrystal. And what is interesting about the carbon nanocrystal is that it's a nanocoating on a copper wire. Wait a second, how come it isn't a copper nanocrystal? So that becomes the question in terms of the understanding, and we see that the diamond structure, although it closes off the ends, we can see that the diamond crystals are transparent. So the nanolayer stacking, instead of aligned as a nanotube, it's aligned as a diamond structure. And this then creates different layers. And as you see that they nest, and you have these nanomonatomic layers, and in between these layers, and in between these fields, you have gaps. So you have nano gaps when you have nano layers. But the gap is not just from one field to the other field, but it's one layer to the other layer. And so you create this star formation, which we call a tetrahedron. And so if you take your first two index fingers and put them together, and you just rotate one hand 90 degrees, you can see that three fingers touch the base, and one finger is the top of the star formation. And that's what we're talking about today is Pico stars. So within the nanocoating, you have this layer of star stacking, and you connect through intermediaries, which we call bonds. They are covalent, trivalent, or tetravalent bonds. So the layers are bonded together in a non-physical way. When we say it's non-physical, we can't see the bond, but we see the action of the bond in such that there is a bonding. So when we look at the monatomic star formations, we see that the bonding is actually a two-way street. The bottom black layer is bonded to the blue top layer, but the blue top layer is bonded to the black bottom layer. Well, and then it flips back and forth. So we have this relationship. And as we connect these stars together, we develop a synergy. And that's where we get a monatomic energy flow, where we have 1 and plus 1 is more than 3, because that energy flow continues. It doesn't stop. It doesn't get expired. It keeps coming. And therefore, we have a product, and that product continues to go. So then we end up where we have multiple monatomic energy flows. And so we develop what we call a superconductor at room temperature. And this is really old science anyway, but to understand that the difference between the let's call it the carbon state, the organic. And the polymer state is that when you have more than three in a chain, that becomes a polymer. But how do we get into the star formation, which now has a formation of a magnetical gravitational relation, and then an increase in that base, where we brought together the matter, antimatter, and dark matter. And then this was demonstrating when we imparted a rotation to the balls. Physically, we created a plasma state around each and every ball. And we replicated this with this old technology in Beijing last year, exactly doing that with the rotating balls. But each point on this star formation had two rotating balls, so they worked together. And so each rotation created a dynamic reaction, and the collective of the dynamic reactors created a plasma field in the center, which was positive. And obviously that was very gravitational. And that's the point. That is the first point of the dimension building. So we see the same thing with water. It too is an energy parceling unit. It comes together with hydrogen and oxygen. But what's interesting is that the hydrogen only carries a mass of 1, and you have 2 of them, and oxygen carries a mass of 8, and you only have 1 of them. But they create a magrav, and it's round. And how does that balance off? And then what happens? You can shear off one of these hydrogens, and that becomes a positive energy that is going somewhere. And then what's left is the hydroxyl, which is a negative energy that is looking to go somewhere. So when you have the one point, you add a second one, and then you connect between those 2 points. You make one connection. And so at that point now, based on surface to volume ratios, you understand that the ends of the line are negative and the connection is positive. But you can bend this line and then create, an energy flow in a perpendicular angle. And so based on surface to volume ratios, the pointy part of the bend is hydrogen and the dull part is oxygen, because the oxygen is bigger. Excuse me. So there you have 2 points coming together. And you continue this dimension building. And then when you put the bend in it, now you've created a hydrogen-oxygen relationship. But it doesn't add up. So you have to impart different energies in the interaction. This is right at the inflection point. And so if we look at the fatty acid, it is in a straight line. One moment, please. Thank you. Because of the hydrogen is balanced on both sides, there are no bends. But because of the delta end and the omega end being different, there is a direction of flow along here. So you can't just say that it's just sitting there doing nothing. The action is constantly giving and taking. And in that process, based on external forces, energy is released. And the alpha-linolenic acid bends. And in that process of bending, it creates a different charge across the bend. And when we get three bends, what we call omega-3, 6, and 9, this is how we create water. But it's three H2Os. And so the top of the band is magnetical, and the convergence is gravitational. And once that's completed, the fatty acid doesn't get destroyed. It maintains its condition and it straightens out, draws in more hydrogen to straighten itself out. And then it bends again. And so we have this flattening out and bending, flip-flopping all the time, and it's a continuous process. And it's hundreds of thousands of times per second. Because each and every cell is doing that. And in that process, that is the difference between a polymer and a protein. A protein begins with an amino acid, you get three together, and there's a DNA, and then it creates different types of fatty acids. And from fatty acids, we become protein, protein becomes cells, and then we have more complex cells. So we have a progression from unstable and simple to very complex and very stable. And that's the difference between polymers and proteins. So the proteins are amino acids as building blocks, and three amino acids are the foundation. It's when we fold over the fourth amino acid that it makes the protein, and the byproduct is water. So there is always creation. You create, and there's an equilibrium, balance of one side and the other side. So if we continue with the dimension building, we see that if we add a third point and just connect two of them, we have the base. But if we add a fourth point and connect the three, now we have a star formation. And that's what we're talking about today is the Pico stars. But Pico stars by themselves are stars, but there's more than one, isn't there? And so you create a field for one star and you have another star, and now how do you connect these two? Well, it's the same way. You add another point, which is a inertia field of the Pico stars, and you connect the two. Same thing happens. But if you modify that, you put a bend in it, so that becomes a modification from an external influence. And so we have different ways to modify, and some of them are very destructive. But they're not destruction, they're deconstruction. Okay, because you just can't wipe it out. Something is always something as opposed to being something else. So now we see that the destruction can be very rapid. What we are on the verge of is introducing how each construction can also be very rapid. If we understand that each point is coming from these two fields and that they come together and they can be modified. So all of these star points coming together from each from the two fields can either decouple, they can stretch, they can compress, they can squeeze, or they can be deformed. And so this is one of the characteristics that we see of skin. And the skin is formed from cells, and cells are ubiquitous within our body. In fact, our body is comprised of cells, 73 trillion cells to say the least, give or take a couple here or there. And these phospholipids have hydrophilic heads and hydrophobic tails, and they come together in layers. And the heads line up, and the tails line up. But the tails are negative, and we know that like charges repel. So what's in that transition zone? That is the inflection point, isn't it? How we go from the outside to the inside. And these phospholipids are integral to the creation of cells in our body. So we see the same thing happening with the polyatomic solid GANS inertia. Because when we take the GANS, which is in the water state, and we dehydrate it, it becomes in the solid state, it's bonded. But these are covalent bonds because they can be crushed into a powder. But they all maintain their gravitational state. And so when we're looking at the dynamic plasma construction, and we see that these ganses are already in a plasmatic state, but it's a plasmatic physical state, just like the rotating balls, and they create a plasmatic environment, and then these interact together. And so we look at that gravitational core that is manifest, and we call that a cell. So 3 in a chain of amino acids, and the fourth one folds over into a star formation, and there we go. So this is how we eradicated the virus in June of 2020, and we did that by either construction or depletion. So it was either a conversion or a deconstruction. So where one gives to the other, and it's either adding to or subtracting from. So now we understand how the GANS of the soul is operating. If we take the cups of life and just take 2 cups of emotion and interact them together, we get a transaction zone. And then if we take 2 cups of physicality and interact them together, that becomes a transaction zone. And when those two interact together, we get this Pico core. And that is the essence of our creation, because it's within and it's extremely tiny. And can it even get tinier? So we see that this tininess is a gravitational entity, and we are that entity, and we're traveling in the magnetical field. So that field has a relationship, and it's held together with a counterweight measure. There's a physical state by weight and an atomic state by mass, but both are gravitational. So the counterweight is in the nuclear state, which we measure in Teslas, and the plasma state, which we measure by time. And those are in the magnetical state. So these two relationships come together, and they all become part of the nuclear feeding inertia. But we can always break this up, just like we break up the GANs or like we break up anything else. They all become fragments of the complexity. And each one has its own gravitational stability, and it also has a dimensional portability. So it depends on the way that they get broken up, depends on the type of dimension that is created. But always the nuclear feeding inertia is showing that when 3 fields come together, they create more than 3, because those energies are still coming and still going. So the fragments of the waves become clues on how we converge and how we diverge, because both have to be in operation at the same time simultaneously. So it's magnetical gravitational, or it's gravitational and magnetical. And it's dependent on an interaction. So which is it? Well, it's the common denominator. So the commonalities are the clues with respect to the convergence and divergence. And that common denominator has an embedded transmission. In other words, now we are looking at magnetical gravitational relationship in each clue. But when we do the transmission, it has to continue magnetical, gravitational, repeat, 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 repeat. And so it flows. And we've seen that in the plasma matter dilemma that we have is how do we go from an atomic state, which has to be balanced on the left and the right side, and then go to a nanostate, likewise has to be balanced, and the GaN state as well. And these are all physical states, but there's a supporting plasma state. And we can travel between all of these states, can't we? So what that means is that the equal sign is actually a plus sign, which means that it's a gravitational point. So the equals of the equality is gravitational. It's the points on the extremities which are at the negative charge, and that negative charge is a giver. So we have an attraction field and we have a repulsion field, and then we have external influences that can create an inflection point. So each point has this characteristic, and so each point then has to have that charge. And every time we have a modification, then we create a gravitational field, which is a balance in the negative positive, which is a MAGRAV condition. And so we can create a reconstruction. How fast can we do that? That's just one of the questions. So we see that the galaxies are doing this very, very well without the Industrial Revolution. They're doing it with a plasmatic revolution. And so these magnetical fields that are traveling squeeze together and become gravitational at the core. And each of these magnetical fields has its own magnetical presence, its own MAGRAV presence, and it's fed by the cosmic rays. And then each one is going through the process of reconstruction because of the gravitational fingerprint. And so we see the hydrogen reconstruction. So we come to a very interesting point. I'm kind of surprised at how some of these teachings that we get are not being given to us, as a basic form of teaching. Like, I don't know about you, but I have never heard of the Roche limit from Edward Roche. It's kind of strange, don't you think? Because we're talking about the structure of Saturn. But the Roche limit is a calculation performed in the mid-19th century. And this explains the structure of Saturn's rings and moons. Well, isn't that interesting? We're having trouble explaining the structure of the Earth, but let's leave that behind and let's figure out what's going on Saturn. And so what is the Roche limit? And Roche's studies examined the effects of strong gravitational fields upon swarms of tiny particles. Well, how tiny is tiny? Is it tiny? Is it really tiny? Is it micro, nano, pico? I don't know. How tiny is tiny? But he is perhaps most famous for his theory that the planetary rings of Saturn were formed when a large icy moon came too close to Saturn and was pulled apart by gravitational forces. He described a method of calculating the distance at which an object held together by gravity would break up due to tidal forces. This distance became known as the Roche limit. Well, so there you go. Now you understand. So for an object, for example, an asteroid or a moon of a particular mass and a size close to another massive object, there is a distance within which it will be torn to pieces by the other object's tidal forces. And this distance is known as the Roche limit. So the problem, number one, is the location of the tidal radius, also called the Roche limit, for two bodies. And this is given by the formula. Oh, here we go. And this is where the PM is the density of the primary body. The PM is the density of the satellite, and R is the radius of the main body. So there you go. Now you can calculate the Roche limit. And so we find that our moon is well outside of the Roche limit, so we don't really have to worry about that too much. But then there are things like the Roche lobe, which describes an object's sphere of influence when it is orbiting a companion, while the Roche potential describes the object's shape, which is also kind of very interesting. And then, of course, there's the Roche sphere, isn't it? His other best-known works also involved orbital mechanics. The Roche sphere describes the limits at which an object, which is in orbit around two other objects, will be captured by one or the other. And the Roche lobe approximates the gravitational sphere of influence of one astronomical body in the face of perturbations from another heavier body around which it orbits. Perturbations. Interesting word. So when we see the conservation of the plasma state dependency, it's a matter-gen two-way street. And in the physicality, we navigate from atomic, nano to GANs. And we can go from one side to the other, or we can go from one state to the other. And so if we look at our cellular boundary, which is made by phospholipids, and we see the circular pattern, so inside is the gravitational convergence and the outside is the magnetical emission. And so that becomes the matter state. But as you can see from this diagram, that the sphere is not exactly spherical, it's kind of flattened out at the poles. And so when we have external influences, we can see with this intensity interaction, and if we're using, say, air bubbles, or soap bubbles, excuse me, and we try and figure out how these soap bubbles are working together, we can find that they actually change. They either stretch or deform, or even change the shape, or there's always an interaction. And so these spheres become dependent on the neighbors, don't they? So this is how, when we look at Saturn's rings, we see that these rings are visible, but there are shadows in between. And these rings are different from the body. That's also different. And so between the rings and the body are gaps, and between the rings are gaps. So are the rules for the gaps in the rings different from the rules of the gaps between the rings and the planet? And how do we do this? How do we jump from the intensity of the manifestation of the planet and the outintensity manifestation of the rings? So dependent on how the energy is transferred, we can see that the density can dissolve. And so if we look at the main structure, and how it dissolves, it would leave the fragments. And so those fragments maintain their maggrav condition. So there's a substitution involved, which is a transference of the gravitational dominance. At that point of substitution, the intensity equals zero and the outtensity equals zero. So that maggrav then disappears. But there's a gravitational conformation that remains. Those are the fragments. And there's a gravitational conformation that dissolves, that being the larger particle. Well, it's interesting that Edward Roche suggests that the rings were formed by a smaller particle coming together with the bigger planet, and therefore it was dissolved into these rings. So it's interesting to understand the relationship, but the conclusion that we get from that understanding becomes different. So we have to understand that there is a two-way street here. So when we look at the emission of intention, so this is dynamic beyond our aura. It's a plasma interaction. One plasma interacting with another plasma, there's a launch point traveling to another target point, and then there's a feedback which emits as a launch point and arrives as a target point. That's the other half. That's the balancing of the books, shall we say. So when we look at these cosmic rays and how they come together and squeeze into PM ticks, which are highly, highly gravitational, aren't they? Because they're 1,000 times smaller than the nano stars. And then they become part of the cellular nuclear PM ticks. And so these cells grow from that point. That point is a Pico star, and it points in all different directions. And so from there it grows. So we can grow a seed into a plant. We can grow a crystal into a larger crystal. We can bake a loaf of bread, or we can increase our love. But that's just a myth, isn't it? Like the myth of Aphrodite, an ancient Greek goddess of love, beauty, passion, and procreation, known for her central role in myths like the Trojan War or in her birth from the sea foam. And she was a member of the 12 Olympians. She was often associated with Venus in Roman mythology. She was considered a powerful, sometimes capricious force, often accompanied by her son Eros. But that's just a myth, isn't it? Just like when we look at the carbon inertia highways and we say, okay, well, the only thing that we recognize is the carbon-12 transmission zone, not the transition of the carbon-14 or the transmutation of the carbon-16. But we have to understand that there is an equilibrium. There's a balance of forces, something behind that is supporting that. And that something behind is reflected because it too has a support behind it. So the one supports the other. And there are multiple inflection points, and they're constantly moving and constantly turning. So when we get down to the Pico star, we are seeing a cosmic ray equilibrium that is not just coming from that one field, but overlapping fields. And each of the fields is a maggrav, which has a balance with a magnetical gravitational force. And then the fields combine and overlap together by obeying the relationship of the magnetical gravitational force fields of the intensity and the outtensity. And then we create that structure in the plasma state. And then somehow, some way that manifests into that physical inertia density manifestation. And so when we talk about biology and we see the creation of the free plasma, how it comes from one star formation and has a transaction zone of a PM-TIC star and gets squeezed together by another transaction zone of a PM-TIC star. And we get this gravitational zone squeezed in the middle in the Pico core. And we see the amino acid creation and how it evolves into carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen, the creation of life. And so then we understand that the cellular structure is within the structure of the physical body. And it's an inertia density manifestation of the emotion. And there's a magnetical consistency because we give out our presence from a gravitational core. And then we have a gravitational consistency. But then we find that the solid GANs accelerates that angular momentum. And that's what we're talking about. Can we facilitate construction much faster? Can we do the construction at many orders of magnitude faster than we have been? So in other words, taking advantage of the relationship of the different plasmas and how they interact together, where one is a larger field than the other, therefore demonstrating the magnetical gravitational relationship and that transaction zone that comes together in that dimension point, which eventually manifests itself into a Pico point. And from that, we have this soul vision construction, which comes from unconditional truth. That's the pure plasma state. And then we have to discriminate. We have to select our own personal star of our physicality. And it interacts with the solar physicality of the star, which has already done so. So this whole business is a pre-selection where the solar physicality of the stars of the universe are shielded by the sun on many levels. And as we come through, we have this gravitational confirmation. We call it the emission of light, but it manifests into the emission spectrum like we see with the oxygen when it crosses that threshold where the oxygen is a non-visible gas, but it gives a visible emission spectrum. So there's a plasmatic decay to GANs, and the GANs decay from gas to liquid to solid. And there's a whole gravitational tracking process. And so we see that there's a supplementation required and due to consumption. And that consumption is an acquired knowledge because it's based on a conditional teaching by ancient teachers. We need to tap into the unconditional teaching by the Creator to fulfill that deficiency that is showing us that there's a new awareness, that the supplementation is a historical threshold that has to be crossed between the cosmic feeding and the loose harvesting. So increase one and decrease the other, and you can change the external influence. Because as we head into the uncharted territory, there are many stars beyond the nanomonatomic state. There are pico stars, and they cover the range from decay to radiation. And that AI is the ancestral intelligence, where we are the technology, we are the inertial product, and we are the image of our dimensional convergence point. That is the point. And so this energy is demonstrating a portability, where we can transition energy through elevation, which is the physical matter state to energy state, or we can, through inertia, energy state to physical matter state. So elevation involves expansion. We are already at the lowest energy state, and we are totally dependent on that. But we often talk about that third eye. Is that third eye a squeezy eye that is emanating from the Pico stars? And so we've been seeking for 628 weeks through the Knowledge Seekers workshops that greater oneness to suddenly transcend the limitations of nuclear science. We've been doing this for over a decade very easily. And here we are learning about the cosmic ray transmission process. So you can join us in February and March of 2026 to learn more on a personal level. And our research teams have to learn on a personal level how to turn diamonds to gold or silver. Because since May the 10th of 2025, we have really got down to the Pico core of truth. And as we build one nation network at a time, and we emit this scientific rescue of opening the blinds, one nation network at a time, see that time is now, because our mission is to bring peace on earth and join humanity with the universal community. We want to bring man as equal to all beings in the universe by teaching the plasma science and technology equally to everyone, that no one is left out and no one is abused due to the lack of knowledge. So help us achieve this goal. Help yourself achieve this goal. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. So we're welcoming all the beautiful plasma travelers of the carbon nations, learning about the new selection process of the new organic plasma science. Each of us can do this. Each of us needs to sign the World Peace Treaty. Choose it, sign it unconditionally, mean it sincerely. The point of the true nanotech is the polyatomic core manifestation. The overlapping fields of the Earth space create a peace dome. And it's the inertia of the present that we see is governed by the dimensions of history. But it's time to learn the history of self in a universal context, because the Pico state promotes the GANs as a peaceful superconductor. The PM techs can now shine as Pico star reconstruction fields, ranging the matter, plasma, and universal state. So let's continue to deliver the plasma science daily via the Peace Dome in a practical exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new outer space age. I hope you enjoyed this trip. Thank you so much for participating.
And thank you, Alex, for delivering. I did interrupt the recording somehow. I was trying to switch over to the iPad, so we're going to have two parts. I probably, sorry about that, interrupted your recording as well. I think Randy picked up on it, but that was operator error in the background inadvertently. So I take responsibility for that, but hopefully Ed will sew it into one piece and put it up on his YouTube channel.
Yeah, so the two parts will be fragments of the whole, right?
Yeah. But the one thing I could tell my wife is, honey, I gave up poker. I'm playing the game that the creator plays, which is dice. Just to mean, of course, the creator doesn't roll dice, but just to give the analogy that the creation is rather random if you understand how the dice game works. Fully random. Even if you set it, even if you pre-position the dice or practice throwing the dice, they still have quite a degree of randomness to the whole process. And this is the way the creator plays. Again, we have the Fibonacci scale, Mr. Keshe said, but I remember him answering a question and said at one point it sort of takes a turn. So it's not a complete Fibonacci, but at some point there's an interaction that happens and it goes in a different direction in a way. That's my understanding of it. But sorry about the recording. Hopefully we'll be able to get that prepared. But gee, Alex, if I had the knowledge you're conveying, I don't know if I'd keep my day job.
Oh, well, don't get overly impressed. I think, when we start to put the pieces together that Mr. Kesh is throwing on the road to knowledge, that, we relate it to what we know, and we expand from there. So don't discount really what we know and say, well, just throw that in the garbage, because what we know has brought us to this position. But, if think of it as if you're coming to a sports venue, everyone is coming at a different path, but they all arrive at that conclusion. So you can clearly see that the path inward is the opposite of a Pico star.
I have a question. I have been throwing around terms and I don't really know what it really means, and that is, what's a star? How does this relate to star formation? I know it's like a triangle of three different points and then another one on top, and it creates a field in between, but what does it have to do with a star?
He showed something with the fingers. Maybe you want to go back to that, Alex. I don't know if that's appropriate, but
Yeah, that's a very good question. I have often wondered, just to uh, throw a different light. Oh my God, another bad choice of words. To throw a different light on that question is that if the sun is a star and the stars in the sky are stars, well, how come those stars are tiny stars, and they're not very bright, but our star is incredibly bright, uh, and yet they're both stars. So yeah, that's a very good question to ask. But the fundamental answer is how they form and interact. And so there has to be a difference. If you have the star formation and the way they're connected, if you don't flip the poles, you can't get that energy flow. You can't line the stars up. And if you don't have a difference between the base and the tip, then you don't have a balance of incentives. So the star formation base consists of, in the way we describe it, as basically with three on the bottom. And so that becomes very gravitational. And the point on the top becomes very magnetical. So it's not the question of how many points are coming in there. It's a question of orientation. Now, the thing is that this is only a one-sided diagram. And what I've been trying to do today is to actually try and broach this position where, when we look at the common denominator and all the clues that come together, they just don't flow as a continuous line, but they have a personality. And in the process of that personality, they change their conformity. And so instead of we see this, we see this. And then that allows us to bring together overlapping fields. So in the basic star formation, we have 4 points. But clearly, when we look at the Pico stars, we see a lot more. So there is no limit to the number of points on the star. It's just that in terms of basic reference, and that's what we're talking about here, is basic Pico state. But when you look at the actual picture of the Pico atomic state, there are a lot of points. And how many points are there? And are they all the same? Do they all have the same number of points? is there a limit to the number of points? Well, you could also say, is there a limit to the number of people? Is there a limit to the number of varieties? I don't know. How big is large? How small is small? So to answer your question there, I think we're comparing the basic star formation and saying, well, some stars, they just are in the sky, and other stars are in the sky, but they're very, very bright. And so the most important star in our solar system is the sun. But the most important star in your system is you. You are the star. So you don't need to go on American Idol, to be a star. You don't need the adulation of everybody to give you that verification and validation that you're special. We're all special because we're all animate. We're all sentient beings. And we didn't fall here, we arrived. So we just need to understand the science better so that we don't get deceived by false prophets. I hope that's helping.
Every little bit helps, absolutely. As I said earlier, or in another meeting, and Mr. Kesha said, it's going to take more than all of us on this planet to open up this knowledge. So that must mean it's quite deep in a way.
Well, this is a key point. If I could just add to Irmgard's answer there, or a question. So one pico point can have multiple points, but multiple pico points coming together also contribute to the strength. So this you've referred to many times today, Mark, that, collectively we are stronger. And this is one of the reasons that the divisive activity of the social structure on this planet is so prevalent, because one way is to increase your strength, the other way is to weaken the others. So you can pick which way you want, but when you are looking at diminishing, you're looking at a very small scheme. And there it is, you're walking beside a river, and you want to drink from a puddle. It is really small-minded in so many ways, and it's a time for us to start to understand that we are members of the universal community. It's just that we seem to be pioneers. So that's why it's such a difficult process.
And as you said, collectively we're stronger, and this is what is being set up in this association, to make a more together, as we do with the elevation of the souls of the leaders and so on. Collectively we're stronger, and that's what's being set up. So, and all he's asking you to do is participate in it if you choose to. And of course, promote it and help develop it and the rest. Okay, let's see if anyone else has a question they'd like to share.
I have a question. I don't know if it's actually relating to what you've done just now. In the workshop, Mr. Cash was mentioning when you increase the frequency and you shorten the wavelength. I guess that's the Doppler effect. Are you able to just give a quick description of how that would look, Alex, or is that a topic for next week?
Hey, Gail, I was going to ask a similar question to that, very similar, just in the last few moments. about this wave or the how it Alex was talking about amplitude, and I know Mr. Kesh said as you widen it, it becomes, I guess, less destructive than if it's a very small. So I was going to ask something very similar. That's interesting. Thank you, Gail.
Yes,
Well,
go ahead.
no, is it okay for this evening or is it a big subject?
No, it's a perfect question because when you look at the change that I made from the strength and we changed the relationship. If you look at the diamond structure, say you're coming from the left, you're coming from far away, and as you come closer, you find that the sound gets louder. And then as you know, imagine it's a train, right? So there's a train in the distance and you hear it coming, and then as it comes closer, it gets very loud. And then once it passes you and you're, say, at that gravitational inflection point, the train passes you and goes away from you, then it gets much quieter. So it's still the same train, it still makes the same noise, and it's just that, you know, the path link is has changed, and the susceptibility is changing based on this path link. So at some point in time, you didn't hear the train, then you heard the train, then it became very loud, and then you became quiet, and then you don't hear the train anymore. And then what do you say? Oh, well, that train has stopped rolling. Is that train only there because it's when it's in your presence? And so I think that's an excellent question. You have to understand now how when these things come together, that it's not necessary for them to be destroyed. Uh, there is a rush limit, if you will. Don't stand on the train tracks when the train is coming, right? But you know, the sound of the train is directly related to how far away it is, and it's also that there's a change in there's a gradient change. So the sound is increasing as it approaches you, and it's decreasing as it goes away from you. So now you have a relationship. Now you know if it's coming or going. And frankly, you can close your eyes and you can tell if the train is coming or leaving, can't you? You don't have to see the train coming. It says, oh, the train's coming. Yeah, I know, I can hear it. So obviously, that kind of information can be imparted to different senses. So we have, you know, touch, taste, feel, sight, sound, and emotion. And that train is moving on emotion. Someone is driving that train. Someone has wanted that train to drive. But, you know, you're the other half. You're the one hearing that train. So both have to be in place in order for you to have a physical manifestation. The train has to be there and you have to be there to hear the train. So on that basis, you understand it's a two-way street. So whether the train is coming or going, the train has to be there and you have to be there. And then
And
interesting enough, if the train is coming into the station and it's slowing down, that changes the sound as well, doesn't it?
yes. So the wavelength, I mean, if your frequency is increasing, then the wavelength has to, or is it time? That's what I wasn't clear on. The wavelength would shorten if the frequency increases,
Exactly correct.
but
So
what happens to the time? It's not constant then. Well, depending on what you want. Yeah.
that's right. So the blue light will orbit faster than the red light. So that's why the blue light has a higher frequency.
So you're actually changing the color of the light.
Exactly.
Uh, creation has happened.
Is that correct?
I didn't think about the color. Oh, thank you.
Well, if you ever go to a nightclub, you know, the lights are reacting to the sound, aren't they?
Well, they try to make it that way.
Oh, wow, they creates an environment, an ambiance.
Hopefully, you don't get dizzy from such things.
Well, that's why they serve alcohol.
But you know, we never used to buy the drinks with alcohol. We were allowed into it was wonderful. And our exercise class would go, and we would order drinks, but tell them no alcohol. And it was fine with them. We're paying the money for something we're not getting. So, you know, we had everybody following us actually because we had such a good time. So you don't need alcohol to just need a good exercise class,
Well, speaking of paying for something you're not getting, that's what happened when we went from leaded fuel to unleaded fuel.
which was a good thing.
Yeah, but we were not getting the lead, and we were
Well,
paying more for it.
well, then both situations are comparable, aren't they? We didn't need the alcohol, and we felt pretty good when we left.
Well, yeah, but how did you feel when you found out that the reason the leaded gasoline was cheaper was because they added the lead? The adding of the lead was an external action.
Yes,
So if you're adding another ingredient, a normal thinker would say, well, that would be more expensive. But by just, what you just said, minusing an ingredient or not adding the ingredient, it becomes more expensive.
but it helps you. I don't look at it from the money point of view, really. I look at it, what is the effect on me? So I would be very happy to, deal with non-leaded and no alcohol when I'm enjoying my evening.
Right. By extension, everybody should be happy with that, but there are people who are unhappy about that. And then the question becomes why. And as I often said, why is not the question, why is the answer? There's another motivation. And
Yeah,
invariably, it becomes from the self-serving greed of man based on the monetizing of all activity.
yeah, exactly. So
So
we're stuck in it. It's like a vortex.
that's right. Well, but Gail, you should know that, I love you, Pontiac, okay?
Oh dear. No, it's a Ford Escort.
Your cheap date.
No, it's the best car on the road for me. It was my size. Well, thank you for your answer, Alex.
We can laugh at the science sometimes, can't we?
Yeah, it's a good thing. You learn more when you can laugh.
Okay, thank you, Gail. Anyone else or Alex? I don't know if you finished that. Or Gail, did you have another response?
No, I that covered it. Thanks.
Well, Mark, I just want to say thanks for everybody for allowing me to continue to present as we are exploring the new frontiers and sorting out our understanding. Please remember that you need to understand it your way and explain it to other people your way so that it makes sense, because we have a lot of knowledge, would-be knowledge seekers on the horizon. So let's increase that Pico star.
Absolutely. Okay, if there's no other comments, questions, or issues anyone is raising, sign up for the association. You'll be part of a much bigger structure, and this is a necessity. So again, totally up to you if you want to get into it or not, but this is the way it's going to be delivered, and this is the way it's set up to be delivered. If you've come up with a better idea, I think you should write to Mr. Kesh and explain a little twist or turn. But I think he's, again, done this before, been there and done that before, as the old American saying goes. So thank you all. We appreciate your presence today. I'm going to take back the screen. I'll play the